A newly appointed police chief enters his station incognito, intending to observe his officers in their natural state. But when a white officer insults and spits on him, believing he's just another vagrant, the entire department is about to experience a revelation that will shake them to their core. On a humid Tuesday morning in August, Richard Nelson, the recently named police chief, stepped from his vehicle in downtown Blue Ridge, a modest town nestled in the gentle mountains of North Carolina, wearing a basic flannel shirt, faded denim, and weathered tennis shoes. He hardly resembled someone who had dedicated 20 years to advancing through law enforcement ranks. This was precisely what he had planned. Richard valued authentic observation over the artificial courtesy of scheduled visits or prepared welcomes. As an African American assuming command of a precinct rumored to harbor troubling behavior, he sought to witness the department's true nature. What more effective method than to move unnoticed through the station's grounds? The precinct's parking area bustled with officers arriving and departing. Richard surveyed the scene, observing the relaxed conversations and occasional curious looks directed his way. Nobody appeared to know who he was, which made sense. His appointment had been declared only recently, and he had deliberately avoided announcing his arrival before the formal introduction scheduled for later that morning. He pulled down his cap's brim and breathed deeply. The burden of his goal to eliminate the corruption poisoning the department weighed heavily upon him. He was accustomed to opposition, but understood this position would challenge him in unprecedented ways. As he neared the structure, distant laughter drifted through the morning air. Richard entered through the station's side door, unnoticed, amid the buzz of relaxed conversation and telephone rings. The polished floors reflected the bright overhead lighting, and the aroma of old coffee lingered in the atmosphere. He moved deliberately, studying the interactions surrounding him. Clusters of officers gathered around workstations, some sharing anecdotes, others examining documents. Nobody gave him particular notice until he stopped beside the employee lounge. "Hey, you." A harsh voice pierced the ambient noise. Richard pivoted to see a white officer approaching him, wearing a self-satisfied expression. His nameplate identified him as Officer Daniels. Behind him, several colleagues leaned against the partition, observing with curiosity. Richard began to respond, but Daniels cut him off. "Are you lost?" "This isn't a homeless shelter," the officer declared, his words heavy with disdain. "You should take your problems elsewhere." Richard went rigid. The statement hit him like a physical blow. He couldn't decide whether to identify himself immediately or allow the situation to develop further. Before he could choose, Daniels moved closer, raising his voice for his audience's benefit. "Didn't you understand me? Leave this place. We don't want your type loitering here." Chuckling broke out among the spectators, and Richard tightened his jaw, his pulse racing. He attempted to speak, but Daniels leaned into his personal space, their faces nearly touching. Then, suddenly, the officer expelled saliva directly onto Richard's face. Everything seemed to halt. Richard's breathing caught as the warm moisture ran down his cheek. Around him, the laughter intensified. One officer struck the counter, bending over with amusement, while another commented about putting troublemakers in their proper place. Richard's thoughts spun. He felt his heartbeat thundering in his head, yet maintained his composure. He reached into his pocket, retrieving a cloth to clean his face, his actions slow and purposeful. "Is this your standard treatment for everyone entering these doors?" he inquired, his voice composed but resolute. Daniels sneered. "Just for those who don't belong." The group erupted in laughter once more, but Richard remained silent. Instead, he turned and proceeded down the corridor, leaving the officers behind as he headed toward the station's administrative section. An announcement system activated, summoning all personnel to the meeting room. The moment had arrived. The conference room buzzed with conversation as officers entered, some carrying coffee cups, others laughing about private jokes. Richard came through a side entrance, now carrying a file bearing the precinct's official emblem. He positioned himself just beyond view, observing the room fill with recognizable faces, some still amused from the earlier encounter. At the room's front, Captain Harris, a stocky man with a graying beard, requested attention. "All right, everyone quiet down. We have an important announcement today." The officers settled, their interest aroused. Daniels rested against the wall, arms folded, his arrogant expression unchanged. The man was clearly enjoying his morning. Captain Harris cleared his throat. "As you're all aware, Chief Caldwell retired last month. We've been awaiting his successor, and I'm honored to present our new commander, someone with an outstanding record and a clear vision for this department." Richard stepped forward, his footsteps measured. The room stilled as he approached the lectern, his commanding presence demanding attention. He set the folder on the stand and slowly examined the room, his calm bearing heightening the atmosphere. Daniels's smugness wavered, color leaving his face as understanding emerged. The other officers exchanged nervous glances, some murmuring, others staring at Richard with astonishment. "Good morning," Richard began, his voice steady. "I am Richard Nelson. Starting today, I serve as your new police chief." The quiet was overwhelming. Daniels's face flushed deep red, his confidence disappearing. Richard's attention settled on him, lingering momentarily before surveying the remaining room. "When I arrived this morning," Richard continued, "I came in civilian clothing because I wanted to observe the department without pretense. What I discovered was enlightening." A whisper passed through the crowd, but Richard lifted his hand to quiet it. "In my short time here, I've witnessed conduct that is not merely unprofessional, but completely unacceptable. Let me be absolutely clear. The atmosphere that has been permitted to develop here ends immediately." The room stayed eerily silent, the impact of his message taking hold. Daniels fidgeted uncomfortably, his attention dropping to the floor. Richard moved nearer to the podium's edge, his tone precise but measured. "Respect is not negotiable. It forms the basis of our work in law enforcement. Without it, we disappoint not only ourselves, but the community we serve." He allowed the quiet to persist, watching the officers shift under his stare. "This morning, some of you found amusement in what you believed was simply another defenseless person being humiliated. But I want to remind you, every person who enters those doors deserves respect, regardless of whether they wear a badge." His words sliced through the room like a sharp blade. Nobody dared move. Richard let the silence continue, his stare unwavering. The tension was tangible, each officer acutely conscious of his statement's weight. Daniel shifted again, his unease obvious, as perspiration appeared on his forehead. But Richard wasn't finished. "I recognize that transformation is challenging," he said, his voice steady but filled with authority. "But let me be explicit. There will be zero tolerance for conduct that dishonors any individual's dignity, whether they are a co-worker, a citizen, or anyone else." He descended from the podium, walking slowly toward the officers. His presence was imposing, yet his tone maintained controlled intensity. "Officer Daniels," Richard said, stopping several feet from the man. Daniels recoiled, his earlier arrogance completely vanished. "You," Richard continued, meeting his eyes, "represent everything dysfunctional in this department. When you spat in my face, you didn't just disrespect me, you dishonored the badge, the oath, and the community we promised to serve." Daniel stuttered. "Chief, I had no idea." "That's precisely the issue," Richard interrupted, his voice sharp. "You didn't care to know. You didn't pause to consider before acting, because you assumed that person before you was insignificant, and that assumption explains why this department has lost public trust." The room remained silent, every officer motionless. Richard addressed the rest of the group. "What I observed wasn't merely one person's error, it was a system. A system where intimidation and prejudice are not only accepted, but encouraged. And that ends now. He returned toward the podium, his voice rising slightly. I've dedicated my career to pursuing justice, not just on the streets, but within departments like this one. Change isn't simple, and it won't occur immediately. But I guarantee you this. While I'm chief, this precinct will function with integrity, respect, and responsibility. Richard paused, allowing his words to resonate. Then, with a slight acknowledgement toward Captain Harris, he concluded, effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended, pending an internal review. And for those thinking this is merely a warning, reconsider. This is the first of many reforms. Shocked murmurs swept through the room. Daniels's face turned crimson, his jaw clenching as he avoided his colleague's stares. Richard, unaffected, stood firm. This isn't about retribution, he stated firmly. It's about establishing standards. If you are unwilling to meet them, this isn't your workplace. He glanced around the room one final time, his eyes connecting with each officer's. If you're prepared to improve, to become better, then we'll progress together. But understand this. I will hold you responsible at every step. The meeting concluded with heavy silence, officers leaving the room without their typical conversation. Richard remained at the podium briefly, watching as Daniel stormed out, his face showing embarrassment and anger. The other officers avoided eye contact, their expressions ranging from guilt to quiet reflection. In his office, Richard settled at his desk, exhaling deeply. He understood this was merely the start. Years of ingrained attitudes wouldn't transform overnight, and for some, they might never change completely. But he hadn't come to Blue Ridge to make allies. He came to create impact. The desk phone rang. It was Captain Harris. Chief, I wanted to mention. You handled that better than most could have, Harris said, his voice hesitant. Thanks, Captain, Richard replied. But the real effort begins now. I need a complete review of Daniels's record on my desk by tomorrow. Complaints, incident reports, everything. You've got it, Harris said before pausing. And Chief, I believe you affected a few of them today, in a positive way. Richard hung up, permitting himself a brief moment of satisfaction before addressing the pile of paperwork before him. Over the following weeks, the precinct transformed. Officers who once laughed at Daniels's behavior now avoided him entirely. News of his suspension circulated through the department. Richard made it routine to walk the corridors regularly, greeting everyone he encountered, his presence a constant reminder of his leadership. Some officers embraced the change wholeheartedly. Officer Reyes, a younger recruit, approached Richard one day, confessing that she'd been complicit in the toxic environment out of fear of consequences. I want to improve, Chief, she said sincerely. That's all I request, Richard replied, his voice kind but firm. It begins with you. But not everyone was prepared to change. Daniels filed an appeal against his suspension, claiming unjust treatment. Richard maintained his position, standing firm in his conviction that accountability wasn't optional. The department's investigation revealed a series of previous complaints against Daniels, from excessive force to inappropriate remarks. His appeal was rejected, and Richard made clear that the era of ignoring misconduct was over. Despite the progress, Richard knew the journey ahead would be lengthy. Discussions about unconscious bias and community relations received mixed responses, but he remained determined. Each small success, a recruit speaking out, an officer reconsidering their approach, was a step toward something greater. One morning, Richard attended a community gathering where he met a young boy who timidly approached him. "Are you really the chief?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with amazement. "I am," Richard said, smiling. "My father says the police don't care about people like us," the boy said, his voice barely audible. Richard knelt to meet his gaze. "I can't change what happened before, "But I promise we're working to do better," he said gently. "And if you ever need assistance, you find me. Okay?" The boy nodded, a small smile appearing on his face. It was moments like this that reminded Richard why he had accepted the position originally. By the end of his first year, the precinct was far from flawless, but it was undeniably transformed. Officers who couldn't adapt were gone, replaced by recruits who shared Richard's vision for a fair and respectful department. The community, once doubtful, began seeing signs of change, a renewed commitment to building trust and healing divisions. Richard stood in the precinct's main corridor one evening, watching as officers departed after their shifts. The laughter and fellowship felt different now, not at someone's expense, but authentic and welcoming. He knew there would always be obstacles ahead, but for the first time, he felt optimistic. Change was never simple, but it was worth every struggle.